Northern Montana Territory, December 1886. By the time the first real snow settled in the Birch Creek Basin, most of the old hands were already saying, "This winter felt wrong." The wind had a different taste. The frost clung a little harder. The sky, on certain mornings, held that pale metallic sheen that made cattle restless and men quiet. No one could explain exactly why, but everyone felt it. Everyone except the new man, apparently. While families were double-chinking their cabins and hauling in every stick of firewood they could drag from the draws, one 49-year-old former railroad carpenter named Alden Pike was out in front of his half-finished cabin, calmly digging a trench like it was mid-June, and he had all the time in the world. He wasn't digging a root cellar. He wasn't digging an outhouse. He was digging his stove. The first person to see it was a trapper named Nolan Grant, riding in from the north with two half-frozen beaver carcasses tied over his saddle. He reined in when the shape of the trench came into view, 24 feet long, 2 feet deep, running parallel to the cabin foundation before curving inward beneath the floor. The removed dirt piled in ridges along its edges, already rimed with frost. "What in God's name are you doing, Pike?" Grant called, breath fogging the air. Pike straightened, leaning on the shovel, face red from effort, beard stiff with ice crystals. "Stove for the winter," he said. Grant squinted. He saw no iron box, no fire brick, no chimney stones. Just dirt and a line of smooth river rock stacked along one side. "That," Grant said flatly, "ain't a stove. That's your grave if you keep at it." Pike just went back to digging. By the time Grant reached the trading post that evening, the story had grown teeth. "You all seen what that Wisconsin fellow's up to?" he asked, stomping snow off his boots. Heads turned, chairs scraped. The pot-bellied stove in the center of the room glowed dull red, the only generous thing in the building. "What's he doing?" said Jonah Callister, a grizzled settler with 20 winters in the territory, and the kind of confidence that only comes from surviving half of them by accident. "Digging a trench through his cabin," Grant said. "Says it's his stove." There was a beat of silence. Then laughter rolled through the room. "Man's lost his mind. He thinking of heating the worms? Bury your fire, bury yourself, that's how it goes." Callister shook his head with slow, theatrical disapproval. "I've seen fools try a lot of things up here," he said. "Open fireplaces made from river rock that explode when they get hot. Chimneys made from green logs that burn their cabins down. But I ain't yet seen a man dumb enough to put his fire underground. Dirt collapses, smoke don't rise. He's building a coffin." Nobody argued. After all, Callister was the closest thing Birch Creek had to an authority on winter. Out at his cabin, Pike worked until long after dark, his lantern casting an orange oval over the raw cut in the ground. He'd timed this carefully. The ground was just frozen enough to be firm, not yet iron hard. If he'd waited another week, the top layer would have turned so solid he'd have needed dynamite to crack it. By the end of October, the trench was finished. It ran like a buried river. Intake pit outside the cabin wall. Then a narrow stone-lined channel turning inward beneath the floor, winding back and forth in a lazy S-curve, before rising to meet a small, tight chimney at the rear corner of the cabin. From above, once the floorboards were laid, no one would ever see it. He gathered stone from Birch Creek, a deliberate, slow process that looked pointless to anyone riding by. Not any rock. Dense, rounded boulders and cobbles, too big to move easily, too heavy to ignore. He tested them by striking them together, listening for the clean ringing note of solid mass rather than the dull thud of crumbly shale. He lined the bottom of the trench with coarse sand, set the stones carefully along the sides, mortared gaps with clay. He left the top of the channel capped with flat rock slabs that fit together like puzzle pieces, sealing the tunnel but giving the mass something solid to push against when it heated and cooled. Only once the trench was fully lined did he lay the cabin floor. Thick planks, tight-fitted, packed with clay and fine dust in the seams. From the outside, to everyone else, the cabin looked painfully ordinary. That made it worse somehow. If he'd built some towering stone monstrosity with a chimney big enough to stable a horse inside, people would have at least called him eccentric. Instead, he'd put all the strangeness out of sight beneath the floor, where nobody could see anything except that he didn't seem to be building a real stove at all. The whispers grew. He's too cheap to buy iron. He don't understand this country. Maybe that worked in Wisconsin. Ain't about country. You put your fire under your feet, you choke yourself. Plain as day. They weren't completely wrong. A badly built trench stove will smoke you out or kill you. The draft goes wrong, gases backflow, carbon monoxide seeps up through floorboards. People die that way. But Pike wasn't improvising. He had seen something like this work before. 15 years earlier, in northern Saskatchewan, he'd spent 3 winters surveying lines for a rail company that never quite made it that far. They'd run out of money, out of patience, and out of political will. But while they'd argued back in Montreal about budgets and rights of way, the survey crews still had to survive. When their own tent stoves proved useless in 40 below wind, the local Woods Cree families had taken pity on them. They showed the surveyors how to shape fire pits below ground level, how to roof them with stone and earth, how to draw air in from one side and guide smoke out the other. Pike had watched a Cree elder named Matthew Firecloud kneel by a subtle depression in the snow, strike a spark, feed the hidden coals, and then step back as a thin plume of smoke rose 20 feet away from a barely visible exhaust hole. "Fire doesn't care if it's under your feet or in front of your face," Firecloud had said through a translator. "It only cares if it can breathe." They dug shallow trenches, lined them with stone, burned dense, hot fires that seemed small and unimpressive compared to the roaring log piles the white men loved. But when dawn came, the snow above those trenches sagged and melted from the heat still seeping up, while the canvas tents around bare ground fires stood cold and stiff. Later, during a stint with a railroad crew in Dakota Territory, Pike had seen Lakota hunters use what the soldiers called a Dakota fire hole, a twin pit system where one hole took in air and the other carried smoke away, the flame burning clean and hot down in the windless dirt between. Those ideas stayed with him. Fire underground, controlled draft, thermal mass. While his neighbors in Birch Creek had spent the last decade learning how many cords of wood it took to barely survive a Montana winter, Pike had been watching fire and earth solve the same problem with a fraction of the fuel. So when he finally filed his own homestead claim in the Birch Creek Basin in 1885, he came with a plan. On November 3, 1886, with the roof finally tight above his head and the trench sealed below, Pike decided it was time for the first real test. He woke before the sun, breath pluming in front of him as he stepped outside into the pre-dawn gray. The creek murmured under a skin of ice. His woodpile, stacked neatly under a rough shed, looked small next to the mountains of timber his neighbors had amassed. He ignored it for now. At the intake pit just outside the cabin wall, he knelt and built a fire. Not the romantic frontier blaze of storybooks. A tight, disciplined little arrangement of pine needles, twigs, and wrist-thick pieces of dry fir. He lit it, watched the flame catch and run. Within seconds the draft took hold. He could hear it, that low, steady inhaling sound, like a sleeping animal finally deciding to breathe deeper. Hot air and smoke raced along the trench, past the curve, beneath the floor, and up through the little stone chimney at the back corner of the cabin. Inside, there was no smoke, no plume, just a faint warmth blooming under his boots. He fed the fire in measured doses for the next 2 hours. Not big logs, small hot-burning pieces that gave everything they had quickly. The trench stones warmed. The earth around them began to soak up the heat. By late morning, he let the fire go out. Outside, the temperature hovered in the low 20s. A light wind knifed down the valley. The sun was pale and weak. Inside, the air crept up to 55 degrees and stayed there. Pike wrote in his notebook, "Test 1. 2 hours firing. Outside 23. Inside peaked 57. Floor warmed to bare hand. No smoke seepage. Draft stable. Fuel used. Approximately 8 pounds. That night, while the basin's other cabins burned wood until midnight just to keep fingers from going numb, Pike added 1 more hour of firing and then slept on a pallet laid directly on the floorboards. He woke once around 2 a.m. and touched the boards. Still warm. He smiled in the dark. 3 days later, someone else finally found out. Nolan Grant, on his way back from checking his traps down valley, noticed something odd as he rode past Pike's place. Every cabin in the basin had smoke coming out of its chimney. The sky above the settlement looked like a blacksmith's yard, thin columns of gray and white twisting into the low clouds. Except Pike's. No smoke at all. Grant slowed his horse. "That idiot," he muttered. "He's given up on heating." He swung down from the saddle and walked up to the cabin door, intending to knock, scold, maybe even offer a few armloads of wood. Callister had been making dark jokes at the post about finding one frozen Wisconsin corpse come January, and Grant didn't much like the idea of that becoming true. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Pike stood there in a plain shirt, sleeves rolled up, not a coat in sight. Grant felt it before he saw anything. Warmth. A wall of it, rolling out of the cabin and into the brittle air. He stared past Pike's shoulder. The inside looked clean, the air clear, no smoke haze, no flicker of open flame. "You got a fire going?" Grant asked. "No," Pike said. Grant stepped inside anyway, baffled. The temperature difference made his eyes water. His mustache thawed along the edges. "What in—" He stopped at a loss for words. "How?" Pike pointed down. Grant knelt and pressed his palm to the floor. He snatched it back. "That's warm," he said. "Yes." "How long since you had a fire?" Pike glanced at the small clock on his shelf. "About 5 hours," he said. "This morning. 2 hours burn." Grant shook his head slowly. "That's not possible. Fire goes out. Cabin gets cold. Every man knows that." "Every man who heats air," Pike said quietly. "I don't heat air. I heat the ground." Grant had no reply for that. He left more confused than when he'd arrived. That night at the trading post, when he tried to describe what he'd seen, nobody believed him. "You're telling me that man heats his floors?" Callister demanded. "I'm telling you he had no fire going, and it was warmer in there than it is in here," Grant answered, gesturing at the glowing stove in the middle of the room. His boards felt like they'd been sitting in summer sun. "Maybe he just put it out," someone suggested. Grant shook his head. "He said he burned it this morning. A short burn. I could smell no fresh smoke. The chimney's cold. Whatever he's doing, it's working." Callister snorted. "It'll kill him later, then. All these clever tricks do. I'll trust a honest stove and a big woodpile before I trust some rat tunnel under my feet." The others nodded, comforted by the assumption that weird things fail eventually. Out at his cabin that same night, Pike sat at his small table with a candle stub, writing by its light. "Neighbors unaware," he scribbled. "Suspicion high. No one asks details. Expect failure. Design sound. Main risk is collapse of trench walls, but stone and cap secure. Draft strong. Need to test under real cold." He didn't have to wait long, because 1886 was not an ordinary year in northern Montana. By the first week of December, the basin began to feel it. The air lost what little softness autumn had left in it. Snow that fell stayed. The stars at night looked sharper than usual, like something had scraped the atmosphere thin. Old men at the post talked about the winter of '57. Someone mentioned the bad year of '69 when 2 cattle outfits lost half their stock. But even they had to admit, quietly, that this felt different. The first hard cold front hit on December 7th. Temperature at dawn, 10 above zero. Temperature by noon, 3. Temperature by midnight, 8 below. Wind came with it, a relentless, needling wind that found every gap in every wall and insulted every frontier builder who'd ever said, "That's tight enough," when it wasn't. Fires roared in stoves and fireplaces all across Birch Creek. Men who'd smugly declared a month earlier that they had more'n enough wood for winter were suddenly counting their stack with uneasy eyes. At the Callister place, they burned so hot the stovepipe glowed red and spat sparks like fireflies when the draft surged. Near midnight, Callister's wife woke him because frost was still creeping across the wash basin in the far corner of the room. "This is as hard as I can run it," he croaked, adding another armful of wood. "Any hotter and we'll burn the chimney down." Down in the hollow, where the Henderson family had built their first cabin, the situation was worse. Their walls were thinner, their chinking poor. The north side of the cabin turned white with hoarfrost. Their youngest boy developed a cough that sounded like his lungs were lined with broken glass. "We need more wood," Mrs. Henderson said, voice tight with fear. "We're burning through it faster than we thought." "We'll get it," her husband promised. "When the wind lets up." At Pike's cabin, the wind screamed against the logs too, but inside, things were different. He rose at dawn, the air in the cabin cool but not brutal. He lit his trench fire, let it draw, fed it for 3 hours until the stones were so hot that the floor directly above the main run felt almost too warm to stand on with bare feet. By 10 in the morning, he'd let the fire die. Outside, the temperature kept falling. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of old lead, and the wind picked up another notch. Snow that had fallen earlier in the week was torn loose and thrown sideways. Drifts erased trails and fences. Horses huddled behind whatever shelter they could find, heads low. Inside Pike's cabin, the thermometer on his wall read 61 degrees. He checked it again at dusk. 62. That night, while the Callisters and Hendersons and Grants took turns stumbling out to their wood piles in the dark, arms wrapped around piles of frozen logs, faces burning from the cold, Pike slept straight through until morning. At dawn, his cabin was still 54. That was when Nolan came the first time, the visit he later try and failed to describe at the post. "You got no idea," he told Callister 2 days later. "I stepped in there from the wind and felt like I'd walked into another season. He's got no stove roaring, no great big iron thing taking up half the room, just that little chimney in the back and the floor warm as a sun-baked rock." Callister only shook his head. "One cold snap don't prove nothing," he said. "We'll see what that rat hole of his does when the real cold comes." The real cold. Even the old-timers didn't see it coming the way it came that year. It started as a rumor. A freighter up from Fort Benton mentioned that trappers along the Marias had lost fingers already. A letter that passed from hand to hand at the post talked about cattle dropping dead along the Milk River, frozen in place after a single night. Then the sky itself seemed to change. On December 15th, the air went dead calm. The usual winter wind vanished. Smoke from cabin chimneys rose in straight white columns, hanging in the air instead of shredding apart. The sun moved behind a thin, high overcast that turned it into a pale disk you could almost look at. Men who'd lived their whole lives facing winter looked up and felt something in their marrow. "This ain't right," Callister muttered, rubbing an old bullet scar in his shoulder. Storms building. At dusk, Pike stepped outside, stood still in front of his cabin, and just listened. No wind, no branches creaking, just a flat, oppressive quiet. He'd felt this once before in Saskatchewan. The old Cree women had come out of their lodges, looked at the sky, and told everyone to bring in extra water and check their roofs. 2 days later, the temperature had fallen so fast that wet clothes froze stiff in the time it took to hang them. He went back inside, set his notebook aside, and silently doubled the amount of kindling he brought in for the morning. The basin slept uneasily that night. On December 16th, the white death of '86 arrived, the storm that would later define that winter, that would break ranches and kill herds and turn whole stretches of open range into graveyards of bleached bone. But in Birch Creek Basin, before anyone knew what it would be called, it began as a temperature reading. At dawn, the Henderson boys' cheap little thermometer read 4 degrees above zero. By noon, it read 4 below. By mid-afternoon, the red line disappeared beyond the lower mark. At Callister's, an expensive mercury thermometer brought up from St. Louis read 18 below by sunset. The air stabbed the inside of your nose when you breathed. Spit froze before it hit the ground. At midnight, the same thermometer read 29 below. The wind came back like it had been waiting for its cue. Not a gentle sigh. A full, throaty howl that rolled down off the high country and knifed through every crack, every knothole, every misplaced plank. Chimneys roared. Stovepipes shook. Men swore and stuffed rags into gaps around windows that hadn't seemed like gaps a week before. Firewood piles shrank visibly, and at the edge of the basin, in the plain little cabin with almost no smoke showing, one man lit his fire underground and prepared to find out whether his trench stove was clever engineering or the stupidest idea any man had ever brought into a Montana winter. He had no guarantee. He had faith in physics, in earth and stone and airflow, in what he'd seen in Cree lodges and Dakota fire holes and Korean ondol diagrams in a book he'd once borrowed from a railroad engineer. But he knew this was the real test. As that first night of -29 rolled over the basin and the wind began to scream like a living thing, every cabin in Birch Creek would be pushed to its limits. And over the next 29 frozen nights, the difference between heating air and heating mass, between brute force and engineered survival, between that man's crazy and that man saved our lives, would be measured not in opinions, but in degrees, in cordwood, and in who made it through to spring. Before we go into what happened during those nights, do one thing for me. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me the coldest temperature you've ever experienced and how you got through it. Because what Alden Pike did next isn't just a story about one stubborn man and his trench. It's a lesson in how forgotten physics buried in the ground can outperform everything the experienced men around him thought they knew. In the next part, we're going to walk through the White Death storm night by night, the cabins that failed, the wood piles that vanished, the temperatures that made steel brittle, and how one so-called dangerous trench stove kept a cabin warm for 29 frozen nights, while others burned through every stick they had, and begged to copy the design they'd called insane. The cold didn't just arrive, it settled. There's a difference. Regular cold stings your fingers, fogs your breath, makes you grateful for hot coffee and a good coat. This kind of cold changes how sound travels, how wood behaves, how people think. By the morning of the 17th, Birch Creek Basin had shifted into that second category. The wind had blown all night, raking the basin with loose snow, piling it into hard drifts between cabins and outbuildings. At first light, the thermometer at Callister's place read 31 below. Inside that cabin, despite a big cast-iron stove running full tilt, the wash basin along the north wall had a skin of ice. The far corner where the children slept hovered just above freezing. "Get more wood," Callister told his eldest boy, voice hoarse from smoke and lack of sleep. "We cut near half a cord yesterday, the boy protested. "We'll run out." "Then we cut more," Callister snapped. "We can sleep next summer." Down in the hollow, the Hendersons were already on the edge. Their stove was smaller, their walls thinner, their supply of seasoned wood embarrassingly low. They'd been burning anything that would catch broken furniture, scrap boards, even a busted wagon tongue that had been leaning against the shed since '83. Mrs. Henderson held her youngest against her chest, counting his breaths. Each one puffed a faint cloud of vapor in the frigid air. "This can't last," she whispered. Up on the gentle rise above the basin, Pike stepped out into air so cold it stabbed the inside of his nose. The night's wind had carved ridges in the snow around his cabin. His breath hung in front of him like pipe smoke. He checked his thermometer, 29 below. Perfect, he thought. The engineer in him, self-taught, stitched together from railroad manuals and Cree advice and hard winters, felt an almost guilty excitement. If the trench stove worked in this, it would work in anything this valley could throw at a man. He went to the intake pit, brushed away snow, and built his fire. Same pattern as before. Small, hot, controlled. Dry pine needles, thumb-thick sticks, a few wrist-thick pieces of dense fir, no great armloads of logs, no shoulder-straining heaves, just carefully measured fuel where it mattered most. The trench breathed. He felt the draft tug at the flame, heard the low, steady pull as hot gases shot under his floor. Inside the cabin, the little stone chimney at the far corner exhaled thin, almost invisible smoke into the brutal air. For 3 hours he tended that fire like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Not bigger, hotter. When he judged the stones had taken what they could, when the floor above sections of the trench felt almost too warm to stand on barefoot, he let the fire die. Outside, the temperature never came up that day. If anything, it dropped another degree or two. Wind tore at stray shingles. Ice grew along horse whiskers. Men out in it for more than 15 minutes came back with eyelashes furred in white. Inside Pike's cabin, by early afternoon, it was 63. He wrote it down. Outside, 31. Inside, steady, 62, 64. Fire duration, 3 hours. Fuel, Aprox. 18 lbs. Floor warm, entire length of out trench. No smoke seepage. Meanwhile, the other cabins in the basin were already losing the first battle of the storm. At the Hendersons, their woodpile shrank visibly over the course of the day. Every time Mr. Henderson stepped outside, the cold seemed worse, like the world was trying to pry the warmth out of his bones. By sundown, he'd burned almost all their seasoned wood. He told himself the cold would break in a day or two. It always had before. At Callister's, they were in better shape. Bigger pile, better stove, thicker walls, but the numbers were turning against them too. His careful count scratched on the inside of the pantry door told the story. Usual winter, half a cord a week in regular cold. Maybe a cord in bad spells. In the last 3 days he'd burned 2.5 cords and the storm had only just started. That night, as the thermometer nudged a hair lower and the wind found a higher pitch to scream at, every family in Birch Creek experienced the same unsettling realization in different ways. At this rate, we don't have enough. Pike slept, not careless sleep. He woke twice. Habit drilled into him by years on survey crews and railroad jobs. Each time he padded barefoot across the floor, felt the board still radiating warmth, checked the thermometer, 56 at the lowest point of the night. He smiled in the half-dark. 29 frozen nights, he'd told himself. That's what he wanted to test, not just a day or two of bad weather, a sustained, merciless stretch where weak designs failed and only the truly efficient systems held on. He didn't know yet that the storm was about to grant him exactly that. December 18th brought no relief. If anything, the cold grew teeth. The breath from every cabin chimney rose straight up in rigid white columns before fraying into the motionless air. The creek ran below a lid of ice so thick you could stand in the middle of it and feel nothing but a faint vibration from the water too far beneath. The Hendersons had run out of seasoned wood by dawn. They started burning green logs. The stove hissed and spat. The heat dropped. The chimney grew dangerous with creosote. At noon, when the temperature outside sat at 27 below and the wind began to pick up again, Mrs. Henderson stood in the center of the cabin and realized there was nowhere in the room she could put her children where they wouldn't be either too close to the stove for safety or too far away to stay warm. "We can't do this," she told her husband. "We'll freeze before the week is out." He said nothing. What was there to say? At Callister's place, the mood had shifted from confident irritation — he'd been angry at the weather the day before — to something quieter and tighter. He'd already sent his eldest son and a hired hand out before dawn to cut more wood from a stand of spruce in a protected draw. When they staggered back near midday, faces chapped raw, hands shaking, they'd cut less than half what they normally would. "The axes bounce," the boy said. "The wood's like stone. My fingers, I can't feel two of 'em." "You'll feel 'em later," Callister said gruffly, but he wrapped the boy's hands in warm cloth with a care that betrayed his own fear. That night, the cabin stayed barely above 50 near the stove, low 40s in the far corner. They burned another half cord. December the 19th. The basin crossed an invisible line. This was no longer just a bad snap. This was something else. One of the cowhands down valley would later tell a story of watching a steer fall dead halfway between the creek and the feed pile, legs locking mid-stride. When they cut it open the next day, the lungs looked like half-thawed meat from a butcher's block. In Birch Creek, subtle things started breaking. An iron hinge snapped when someone slammed a shed door. A bucket handle cracked. A leather boot sole, dried too close to a fire, split down the middle, and in more than one cabin, tempers began to fray. "You should have cut more wood," one woman hissed at her husband. "You were the one who said we had enough," he shot back, eyes lined with exhaustion. They both knew the blame didn't matter. They still had to make it through, whatever this was. Up on his rise, Pike was beginning to see the true scale of the storm as a set of numbers. Day 3 of deep cold. Nighttime lows below -30. Daytime highs never breaking -15. Wind off and on. Snow drifting steadily. He fired his trench stove each morning, never more than 3 hours, never using more than 20 pounds of wood. By noon each day, his cabin sat in the low 60s. At night, it never dropped below 52. From a purely physical standpoint, it was beautiful. From a human standpoint, it was about to become deeply uncomfortable for his neighbors. Because on the morning of the 20th, somebody broke. It was Henderson. He'd stood it as long as he could. Pride and stubbornness and that frontier insistence on "will manage" had kept him from doing what he now found himself doing, slogging uphill through waist-deep snow toward the one cabin in the basin that, rumor said, wasn't in trouble. He had no real plan. He told himself he was just checking on Pike, maybe seeing if the stranger wanted to share a wood-cutting run. But his hands were raw and bleeding. His lungs burned from smoke. He'd slept maybe 3 full hours in the last 2 nights. A man in that state doesn't go visiting for casual reasons. He knocked. Pike opened the door in shirt sleeves again. Heat spilled out, soft and steady. Not the blistering heat that rolls off a stove door, but something gentler that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For a second, Henderson couldn't speak. His face hurt from the sudden change. "Come in," Pike said simply. Henderson stepped inside and shut the door. Quickly, like he was afraid the warmth might leak away if he left it open. He took in the room automatically, eyes skimming for a stove, for a heavy iron belly glowing red, for stacks of wood near at hand. He saw none. "What's your fire?" he blurted. "Where is it?" "Had it this morning," Pike said. "It's out now." "It's out," Henderson repeated. "Yes." Henderson's hands shook as he pulled off his mittens. The air in the cabin felt like late spring. His gaze fell to the floor. "Folks say you dug something," he said. "In the ground. A dangerous stove." Pike almost smiled. "They said dangerous?" "They said you'd suffocate," Henderson admitted. "Or that it'd collapse. Or that you'd wake up dead from the smoke." "And yet," Pike said mildly, "I am not dead." Before Henderson could answer, Pike gestured downward. "Feel it," he said. Henderson knelt and laid his palm flat on the boards near the center of the room. He jerked his hand back. "That's hot," he said. "Warm," Pike corrected. "Hot would burn you. This is stored." "How long since the fire?" 6 hours, Pike said. Henderson swallowed. My water pail froze solid on the table last night, he said quietly. We're burning everything we own. 2 more days like this, and I don't know what we'll do. Pike heard the thing Henderson didn't quite say. Me children are at risk. How much wood you using? Pike asked. Near a cord every 2 days since the real cold hit, Henderson said hoarsely. We didn't have enough stacked for that. Nobody did. Sit, Pike said. Warm your hands. I'll explain what I did. Then you can tell the others. What followed would become one of those conversations that ripple outward, that you can later trace a whole chain of decisions back to. Pike pulled out a bit of charcoal and a scrap of board. He drew a rough diagram. The trench intake, the underfloor channels, the chimney. Fire here, he said, tapping the intake pit. Air pulled in by draft. Heat travels under the floor through stone-lined channel. Stones take the heat, not the air. When fire dies, stones stay warm for 24 hours or more. They give heat back slowly. Like a big rock stove, Henderson said, squinting. Like a battery, Pike said. For heat instead of electricity. You charge it once a day. It feeds you warmth all night. Henderson stared. But how? He asked. Why don't you freeze when the fire goes out? Every cabin I've ever known, the fire dies. You start losing the fight. Because you're heating the wrong thing, Pike said gently. You heat air. Air escapes. Leaks through logs. Up the chimney. Out the door every time you open it. You need constant fire because you're filling a bucket with a hole in the bottom. And you're not? I heat mass, Pike said. Stone, dirt, the ground under your feet. They don't leak. They don't drift away. Once they're warmed, they cool very slowly. You can let the fire die and still have heat for hours. He explained the cree pits, the Dakota fire holes, the way Korean ondol floors sent exhaust under stone beds. He talked about specific heat. He didn't use the textbook term, just the idea. Stone takes a lot of heat to get hot, he said, and gives it up slowly. Air heats fast and cools fast. Why would you choose the second when you can have the first? Henderson listened with the look of a man whose world is shifting under his feet in a way he hadn't expected. How much wood you burnin'? He asked finally. Pike thought a moment. Since the real cold started, he said. Maybe 20 pounds a day, less some days. One small stack, about knee-high by 2, would last me a week. Henderson swore softly. That's not possible, he said. We're burning that much before noon. Pike shrugged. That's what the numbers are, he said. You can ask Nolan. He saw on a mild day. The difference is only bigger now. Henderson sat in silence for a long moment. In that moment, a few things died quietly. His pride, his faith that how we've always done it was enough, his assumption that strange meant wrong. Could I build one? He asked. In my place. Not now, Pike said. Ground is stone. You'd never get a trench cut deep enough this winter, but you can make something. Shorter. Shallow. Along one wall. A bench with channels. Not as good, but better than what you have. Can you show me? Henderson asked. Pike nodded. After the storm, he said. If you want to survive until then, there is one thing I can give you now. He walked to a corner, pulled back a small tarp, and revealed his woodpile. It looked almost comically small compared to the hills of wood outside Callister's cabin, but there was more than enough for one man to ride out the rest of the month. He knelt, measured with his eye, and began stacking an armload. You'll freeze, Henderson protested immediately. Pike shook his head. I will not, he said simply. I have margin. You do not. Take this. Burn it slowly. Burn small, hot fires, not big ones. They give more heat to the stove and less up the chimney. Henderson took the wood, shame warring with gratitude across his face. Why? He asked suddenly. You're new here. We laughed at you. Called your stove dangerous. Why would you give up any of your wood for us? Pike paused, with the last piece in his hand. Because I remember being the one who didn't know the better way yet, he said. And because winter doesn't care who was right in the fall. It only cares who's warm enough to see spring. When Henderson trudged back down the hill carrying that precious armload, cheeks burning from the cold, his story grew in the telling. By the time he reached his cabin, he'd decided one thing. The others had to know. That evening, despite protests from his wife, he stopped at Callister's on the way back from checking the trap line. The older man opened the door, looking like the winter had carved 10 extra years into his face in 4 days. Smoke stung his eyes. His beard was rimed with frost from repeated trips to the woodpile. "What?" he snapped, then caught himself. "Sorry, come in if you're freezing to death. There's room by the stove." Henderson stepped inside. The heat in Callister's cabin was intense, too intense near the stove, weak at the walls. "It's warm," Henderson said. "Warm?" Callister snorted. "Near the stove it is. My Mary slept with frost on her hair this morning, 2 steps from that bed. I can't keep the whole room at 60 if the devil himself were feeding the fire." He threw another log on the blaze like he was trying to punish it. "I went up to Pike's," Henderson said. The room went quiet. "Did you now?" Callister said slowly. "Did you clap for his rat-hole stove?" Henderson swallowed. "It was 64 in there," he said. "Thermometer on the wall. He hasn't had a fire going since morning." "You're mistaken," Callister said flatly. "I put my hand on his floor," Henderson said. "Burned my palm near." He showed his hand without meaning to. The skin was still pink. "He's heating the ground," Henderson said. "Not the air. Heat comes up all day and night, uses maybe a quarter what we do, maybe less." For a long moment, Callister said nothing. Then he did what a lot of proud, experienced men do when someone shows them something that upends years of hard-won knowledge. He laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "Oh, he's heating the ground," he said mockingly. "Next you'll tell me he's warming the sky, too. You seen it yourself, you said. Then you got fooled same as Nolan. Some trick. Some extra stove hidden. You cannot get summer out of winter on 10 sticks of wood. Not in God's Montana." Henderson held his ground more stubbornly than even he expected. "I don't care if it fits what we know," he said. "It's what is. Man's either discovered witchcraft, or he understands fire better than we do. Either way, he's warm, and we're burning through our winter in a week." Callister's jaw worked. "I've survived 20 winters here," he said quietly, "without burying my fire like a criminal hiding evidence." "And this one's worse than any of them," Henderson shot back. "There's no shame in learning a better way." Callister's eyes glittered. "Go home and feed your own stove," he said finally. "We'll see whose house stands come February." And he closed the conversation and the door with more force than necessary. Pride can be as deadly as cold. The storm went on. December 21st, 22nd, 23rd. Daytime highs stayed below -10. Nights dipped into the mid-30s below 0. The wind came and went, but the cold itself never loosened its grip. Cabin. Woodpiles shrank to bare stubs. Frozen logs piled in emergency drifts near doors. Every time someone stepped outside, they felt the air trying to pull the warmth out of their lungs. At night, even with massive fires roaring, some families could see their breath at the far edges of their single rooms. In Pike's cabin, the routine never changed. Morning fire, 3 hours. Stones charge, fire out. All day, steady warmth. Even when he opened the door, a thick cushion of heat clung near the floor and walls instead of rushing out in a panicked spill. At night, he'd draw up a chair, place his bare feet on the floorboards above the main channel, and feel the slow, unwavering warmth rising through the wood. On Christmas Eve, a thin knock came at his door again. This time it was Callister's son, not Callister himself. The boy's face was gray with exhaustion. His eyes were red from smoke and lack of sleep. "Pa sent me to ask a thing," he said, words tumbling out awkwardly. "He said not to bother you, but Ma, she said if there's a better way and we don't at least ask, we're fools." "You're not bothering me," Pike said. "Come in." The boy stepped inside and visibly flinched at the warmth. "Is it true?" he blurted. "You only burn in the morning?" "Yes," Pike said. "And your floor. Does the rest?" "Yes." The boy looked like someone fighting tears who refused to blink. "Pa says it's dangerous," he whispered. "Says you'll suffocate. Says you'll wake up dead. But we ain't got wood left for another week like this. I heard Ma crying last night. She thinks I didn't, but I did. I got 2 little sisters. If there's a way to use less wood." His voice broke. Pike regarded him for a long moment. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Elias," the boy said. "Elias," Pike repeated. "Let me tell you something. Your father is not wrong to be cautious. A bad trench stove will kill you. If you trap smoke under your floor with nowhere to go, if the draft is weak, if you build it without understanding, you'll poison a family in one night. He is right to fear what he doesn't understand, but that fear shouldn't stop him from learning." "Will you teach him?" Elias asked. "I'll teach anyone who wants to know," Pike said, "after the ground softens. For now, all I can do is share wood and share what rules I can, how to build smaller fires, how to keep more heat in their cabins instead of up their chimneys." He sent Elias back down the hill with another modest armload and a set of instructions. "Pack clay around your stovepipe where it goes through the wall," he said. "Hang blankets a foot inside your door. Make a second curtain so every time you open it, the wind doesn't come right through. Put all your beds low as you can. Warm air rises. If you sleep high, you lose it." "They taught you this?" Elias asked. "Those Cree folk you mentioned, the ones with the ground fire?" "They taught me what worked when death was outside the door," Pike said. "And they didn't have the luxury of ignoring something that worked just because it didn't look like what their grandfathers did." Elias nodded solemnly. Back at the Callister place, the argument that night was quieter than before. "Is he a sorcerer?" Mary Callister asked, half in jest, half in dread. "Your boy says his floor's hot." "He's a man with too much time to dig and read books," Callister said tiredly. "But—" He hesitated. "But we're nearly through what we cut," he admitted, "and the ridges are bare for a mile. The boys can't go much farther in this without frostbite." Mary looked at him and didn't say, "I told you." She only said, "Then maybe let the book-reading man show you a thing or two. Or at least admit his trick works better than ours." Callister drank that in like medicine that tasted wrong and helped anyway. "Maybe," he said. The storm did not care about any of this. It went on. December 25th. Christmas. The Henderson children woke to find that their tin cups of water, left too close to the outer wall, had frozen halfway solid overnight. They still managed to laugh when their mother produced a small cloth-wrapped bundle from the deepest corner of a trunk, a handful of hard candies she'd saved since summer. At the Callisters, breakfast was hot and heavy: flapjacks, salted pork, strong coffee. They needed every calorie they could cram in to fight the cold that seeped in through every crack in the world. Up on his hill, Pike marked the date in his notebook. "Christmas," he wrote. "Outside, 30 at dawn. Inside 60 with no fire since yesterday morning. 29 frozen nights will be too easy at this rate." He paused, then added in smaller script, "Neighbors are failing. Storm is teaching faster than any man could." On December 26th, a small thing happened that changed Callister for good. He woke before dawn to add wood to the stove, and found his youngest daughter sitting up in bed, teeth chattering, eyes wide in the firelight. "I had a dream," she whispered. "I dreamed we lived in a warm house, all over, not just by the fire. You and Ma weren't tired. You weren't angry. The whole house was warm." He stood there with a log in his hand and felt something in him crack that had nothing to do with the cold. After sunup, he put on his coat, picked up his hat, and told his wife, "I'll be back." She knew where he was going. He trudged up the hill through drifts so hard he could almost walk on top, following the same path Henderson and Elias had taken. When Pike opened the door to his knock, Callister didn't bother with preambles. "I've been wrong," he said bluntly. "Can I see what you've done?" Pike stepped aside. "Of course," he said. Callister stepped into the cabin and stopped dead, exactly as the others had. 62 degrees inside, 31 below outside, no fire burning. He walked slowly, methodically, around the room. Checked the chimney with his bare hand. Cold. Opened the firebox at the intake pit. Empty, just white ash and soot. Stamped his boots on the floor, then knelt to press his hand to the boards in 3 different places. Warm in a line from door to chimney. "Explain," he said gruffly. So Pike did. But this time he went deeper. He talked about how a cubic foot of stone could store many times the heat of a cubic foot of air. How wrapping your living space in earth meant the cold had to fight through something dense and slow to change, not just the thin shell of log and chink. He sketched the curve of his trench on the board, showed how the fire's path maximized contact with stone. Straight chimneys waste heat, he said. Hot air shoots up, gone. This path forces it to linger. Think of it like this. You can pour a bucket of hot water through a pipe and catch only a little heat, or you can soak a sponge in it and have warmth long after the bucket is empty. The stone is my sponge. Callister listened, like a man replaying the last 20 years in his head and seeing for the first time how much of what he'd done was brute force instead of understanding. "How much wood have you burned total since the cold snap?" he asked. Pike checked his notes. 3/4 of a cord, he said. Maybe a bit more. Callister closed his eyes. He'd gone through 4 cords in the same time. 4. Some things you only learn by counting, Pike said quietly. If I told you this could work when it was mild, you'd shrug. When every stick you cut feels like it cost you years of life, you start listening. Callister opened his eyes again. I called your stove dangerous, he said. I told half the valley you'd be found dead in here. And were you wrong? Pike asked, not unkindly. Without proper draft, this would be deadly. Without stone and clay and care, the roof could burn or the floor could smoke. Fear keeps people alive, but it also keeps them in the dark sometimes. Callister looked down at the floor again. I want to learn it, he said finally. Not today. Not with the ground like glass, but when the thaw comes, I am not spending another winter fighting my own roof for heat. You'll help the others too? Pike asked. Yes, Callister said. I will. They listen to me more than they do to you. That's my fault. I'll fix it. Pike nodded. Then the storm has done its work, he said. The worst of the White Death hung over Birch Creek for just under 2 weeks. 13 days of deep cold, 13 nights below -25, 7 of them below -30. In that time, the basin burned nearly every stick of wood it had stacked, except for the pile under Pike's tarp, which still held enough for another month at his consumption rate. 2 families had to share quarters by the end of it, doubling up in the largest cabin because one of the smaller ones could no longer be kept above freezing. They slept packed together like freight, sharing breath and blankets. 2 children suffered frostbite on fingers and toes. 1 cow died in a drift less than 20 yards from its shed, and 1 man, whose neighbors had called him insane in October, quietly proved that their entire understanding of winter heating had been off by a factor they hadn't even thought to measure. When the worst finally broke, when a Chinook wind whispered down out of the Rockies and the temperature jumped 40 degrees in a single afternoon, sending snow sliding in wet sheets off roofs. The basin felt like a place waking up from a bad dream. Men came blinking out into air that no longer hurt to breathe. Women pulled bedding outside to air it. Children ran for the first time in 2 weeks without feeling like their lungs would shatter. At the trading post, someone chalked a line on the wall. "Storm of '86, it read. 13 days hard, 7 days hell. Below it, in smaller letters, someone else had added, "Ask Pike how to build next winter." Because by the time the storm let go, there was no argument left. Nolan had seen the warmth. Henderson had seen it. Elias had seen it. Callister, proud, experienced, stubborn Callister, had seen it, measured it, felt it in his bones. Spring came slowly that year. Snow stuck in the shaded draws until well into April. The creek ran high and bitter cold, full of broken ice, but the ground, inch by inch, softened. As soon as it did, the real work began. The first man to show up at Pike's place with a shovel wasn't who you'd expect. It wasn't Henderson or some young homesteader eager for innovation. It was Callister. He carried his shovel like a penitent man carries a candle. "Show me where to dig," he said. Pike walked with him to his cabin. They stood in the main room, looking at the familiar layout. Big stove, wood box, beds along the walls, table near the one small window. "You'll have to tear up your floor," Pike said. "I suspected," Callister replied. "You sure?" Pike asked. "This will be uglier before it's better." Callister shrugged. "Winter did that already," he said. "I'd rather break my floor than break my family on another 4 cords of wood in a fortnight." So they pried up planks, cut a trench. Not as long as Pike's. Callister's cabin sat on rock close to the surface in one corner, but long enough to hold a decent run of stone. As they worked, other men began drifting in. Henderson came. Miller, the freighter. 2 younger homesteaders from down valley. Even a ranch hand from a spread farther out, sent by a foreman who'd had to watch too many calves drop that winter. None of them quite knew how to ask. Pike spared them the awkwardness. "I'll show you all," he said, "but I need you to promise something. You build this wrong, you'll kill people. This is not a trick for playing at. It's a system. It has rules." "What rules?" Miller asked. "First," Pike said, "the fire must have a clear path. No tight turns that trap smoke. Second, your chimney must draw strong. If the draft fails, you stop using it until you fix it. Third, you use stone that will not crack or explode. No wet river rocks, no flaky shale, solid granite, basalt, dense sandstone. You test them in a small fire first. If a stone breaks, you do not put it under your floor. Fourth, you respect that this is not magic, it is physics. If something smells wrong, if smoke comes where it should not, you stop." They listened with the intensity of people who had been given a reprieve and didn't intend to waste it. That summer, Birch Creek Basin became a strange sight. Cabins with their floors missing in strips. Trenches cut in arcs and zigzags. Piles of stone sorted by size outside of homes. Pike moved from cabin to cabin, correcting angles, adjusting depths, checking chimney placements. At Callister's, he had them wide in a curve. "Smoke is lazy," he said. "Give it room to move and it will. If you pinch it, it will find a leak, and that leak will be into your lungs." At Henderson's, whose family couldn't afford to tear out their whole floor, they built a hybrid system. A raised stone bench along one wall with channels under it. "Not as efficient," Pike said, "but you'll sleep on it. That's where your body needs warmth most. Heat your sleeping, and you'll bear the rest easier." By early fall, 5 cabins in the basin had trench stoves buried under their floors or benches. When the first real cold came that year, every one of those cabins watched their thermometers with almost religious anticipation. It worked. Not all equally. There were miscalculations and rough drafts. Callister's first run didn't draft cleanly until they added 6 inches to the chimney height. Henderson's bench took longer to charge than expected because the stone mass was too thick near the firebox. But in every case, wood use dropped. Comfort rose. Last winter, we burned near 12 cords, Callister wrote in a letter that somehow found its way into a territorial newspaper. This winter, with Pike's system, we burned just over 5, and we were warmer by far. I have spent 2 decades building cabins, and I say plain. The man who heats stone instead of air is a wiser builder than I have been. Word traveled, not fast. Nothing traveled fast in those days, but steady. Pike would later hear of a ranch 4 valleys over building a trench beneath its bunkhouse. A line camp in the Judith Basin that had ripped out its old stove to try a stone bench after one of their hands spent a storm week at Callister's and came back a believer. Some of these copies were poor. A few were dangerous. One, hastily built with loose rocks and a bad draft, smoked out an entire family and could have killed them if they'd been deeper asleep. Those failures proved another thing Pike had been saying quietly all along. This was not a toy. Traditional systems that used thermal mass and buried fire came with not just cleverness, but discipline. The Cree didn't play with their below-ground pits. The Koreans built ondal channels to strict patterns. The Romans had rules for hypocauste heights and outlet sizes. The West liked to cherry-pick tricks and ignore the discipline. Pike did his best to keep the discipline attached. He wrote in his clumsy but legible hand a set of notes that someone later grandly called the Birch Creek Papers. They weren't anything fancy, just measurements, material preferences, diagrams, how long to burn, how hot, how to test for leaks. He sent copies, by way of passing freighters and surveyors and curious ranchers, to anyone who asked. He never charged. He never tried to patent it. The idea that you could copyright the principle of heating stone would have seemed insane to him. "It isn't mine," he would say when someone tried to thank him with money. "I learned it from people your newspapers call primitive. They learned it from people before them. I just dug a deeper trench and wrote it down." Years later, long after Pike was gone, when modern builders would begin rediscovering the value of thermal mass and radiant floors and earth-sheltered construction, they would do so with the help of infrared cameras and computer models and R-value charts. What those cameras and models and charts showed them was exactly what the storm of '86 had shown Birch Creek the hard way. Heat stored in mass is worth 10 times more than heat dumped into air. Systems that work with the earth beat systems that fight it. And sometimes the dangerous trench is safer than the respectable stove that burns through every resource you have. If you found something in this story that made you think differently about heat, about old knowledge, about what we call primitive versus what's actually just refined through survival, make sure you're subscribed. Because this wasn't a one-off miracle. Across the frontier, from Russian stoves to sod houses to stone dugouts and ground fires, people who had no backup plan and no grid learned to treat physics as something you listened to, not something you argued with. In the next stories we cover on this channel, we'll look at other insane designs that outperformed respectable ones when it mattered most. The cabin that stayed warm with half a roof, the hill-dug shelter that needed almost no fire at all, and the homestead that turned a root cellar into a heat battery. Until then, remember Birch Creek in '86. A whole valley almost lost a winter's worth of wood in 2 weeks, and one quiet man with a buried fire showed them they didn't have to. They just had to be willing to dig deeper, literally and mentally, than, "This is how we've always done it."